And we're now with the general session. And the first talk is by Nikola Garber, Today's Research and Extension for Tomorrow's Seafood in Working Waterfronts.
Thank you very much. I'd like to also thank my co-contributors, Michael Russ of NOAA's Office of Aquaculture and LaDon Swann from Mississippi, Alabama Sea Grant. I'm the Deputy Director in the National Sea Grant Office, and listening to some of these talks, I did aquaculture actually in the field in the mid-90s at the Gulf Coast Research Lab, population genetics. In the last 18 years, I've been in DC working on the policy side of life. So today, really the sub thinking of this is, what's the federal government and university role in aquaculture? We hear it a lot. Many of you set me up well for this talk, all the previous talks. And we get a lot, why should the federal government be funding aquaculture? Why should university be doing aquaculture? So I want to throw out some thoughts to you all today, and I look forward to talking to you more over time to help me craft some of what we can be telling people back in DC about why these are important programs. So today we'll explore the U.S. aquaculture landscape, public versus private funding, what's the NOAA university role in aquaculture, and what can each of you do? I see that my trade deficit is a little bit lower than many of the others of yours, but Secretary Ross did highlight in his confirmation hearings the desire to correct the $14 billion seafood trade deficit, and he didn't specify how, but that we know that that can't just be with wild-caught fisheries because of our sustainability and everything else and how well we're managing it, so aquaculture is included in that. The U.S. imports 80 to 90% of its seafood, and the stakeholders are increasingly asking NOAA to expand seafood farming and uses of aquaculture. We have a substantial potential to significantly increase marine and Great Lakes aquaculture production, and as many of you have said already, if done right, it can provide significant benefits to coastal communities and the environment. There are many barriers to U.S. aquaculture, ones that we work on in NOAA. The challenging permitting process that some of you were talking about last night at the reception and then again today, the social license to operate, conflicting uses of space, environmental concerns, and technology needs. So one of our speakers actually talked about the amount of U.S. water. So this slide here is from about 2012, and the legend is the orange is the total land area of each of these countries, and these are the top 13 aquaculture producers worldwide. The blue is the total water area, inland, and exclusive economic zone. And the big fish, or the really little fish, is how much each of those countries produce. So as you can see, we have the most land and we have the most water. We may have some conflicting uses to deal with in those areas, but our fish is really small. So we have a lot of potential here in the U.S. And also the sources of all seafood combined in the U.S., the fish on the side there, U.S. farmed at this time in 2012 was 2.5%. Wild caught U.S. was 6.5, 45% was imported wild caught, and 46 was imported farmed. There is signs of progress. Last year, NOAA captured numbers, and there was a 5% annual growth in marine aquaculture. Hey, we're doing well. Aquaculture is now the third most valuable fisheries in the Northeast. Many new aquaculturists are from fishing families. Major U.S. seafood companies own the U.S. fish and shellfish farms, and public perception is starting to shift. So we did a back of the envelope calculation that at 5% growth, to hit Secretary Ross's desire to decrease the trade deficit, that we would increase from $386 million to $1 billion of marine aquaculture product in 20 years. So the question is, how do we increase that number? 5% sounds good until you put it into this context. And if our math is correct, we need to speed it up. So let's look at private versus public funds, or private and public funds. So some things are inherently governmental. You have tools for rules, economic models and multipliers, statistics, marine spatial planning, etc. You also need private industry at a critical mass to fund research to operations. I think a lot of times people think of medicine or pharmaceuticals, and there's a lot of proprietary research going on that they're funding themselves. But as many of you have already spoken, small businesses aren't there yet. You don't have that extra money sitting around to fund the next greatest research technology. We may be there for some of the species, but I contest this is why we need government and university assistance to move some of this forward. As I keep hearing in DC, especially in the Gulf of Mexico with the offshore aquaculture, everyone wants to be first to be second, because the first one's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort. So once that first person gets out there, there's a number of investors, they're just waiting for that first one to go, and then they can be that second person out there. And then the third one is a little bit difficult to think about or difficult to deal with, and it's really public and private together. But it's that technology development to assist both economic and environmental bottom lines. A lot of these companies, you're going to be going for a better economic bottom line, but it may not necessarily be the environmental bottom line. So how do we get that double or multiple bottom lines where we are changing both the economics and the environmental ways of moving the industry forward, and not having to have the government have a stick to say, well, we need to bring this industry, whichever one it is, it's discharging too much, or it's doing X, Y, or Z, and we come in with regulations. How do we come in with research and help move these industries forward, or come in with extension to help out and move things forward on both sides? So some of you may have seen this was our famous research to applications, and a number of other agencies use it. The research RLs are 1 to 2. Those are really research that's 10 years or more out. The RLs, the research levels 3 to 5, are really what's in the next 5 years, what's coming. Really where extension is, and many of you all here, is that demonstration, deployment, getting it to operations. How do we take the research that's already there and move it out to the industry and users? So let me tell you a little bit. You may all know this already, but just in case, you'll hear, and sometimes it gets a little confusing, you'll hear people say NOAA's aquaculture program. Well, our program is bigger than Sea Grant, it's bigger than NIMS, and it's bigger than NOS. So we have a lot of parts in NOAA that deals with aquaculture. NIMS, as Rachel was already talking about earlier, the Office of Aquaculture and NIMS is more the regulatory and policy branch and the science for management. OAR is our parent, but where Sea Grant sits, we're the university side, the extension, the technology and industry development, and most of the grants that go out of NOAA come through us. And then NOS, the National NCOS, they do the spatial planning, so they've probably worked with some of you in here on how do we move everything around, where's the shipping lanes, if we're doing an environmental impact statement. In some of these areas, they've started to do one and found out they're right in a military zone. So they can't site a cage there because the military has rights. You may not know about it because you don't have the security clearance, but there are people in NOAA that can help work through the spatial planning and lay out where there's actually even places offshore that we can go with aquaculture. So here's the last 2 years in NOAA aquaculture funding in the millions. NIMS, this is the Office of Aquaculture budget. The stars mean this was what was appropriated by Congress and signed by the president. So they had $6.3 million last year. This year they got a $3 million bump up, and that additional $3 million is providing $1 million additional funding for oyster research and $2 million for regional pilot projects for NIMS. And they're working on how that money is going to go out. In the Sea Grant budget line, we got a $500,000 uptick from 16 to 17, and that most of that money is going out in the 2 competitive calls that many of you probably applied for here in this room. Both are up to 150K impediments, getting over what's that next step to move you forward, and up to $1 million over 3 years to really increase production in the next 2 to 4 years, working with Sea Grant, working with end users and researchers, whatever's needed to move us forward. Saltonstall Kennedy, some of you may know that is a tax on some of the imports, and $2.6 million in 2016. The projects that were selected were aquaculture, and then it's still in process for 17. And the small business innovative research comes from a percentage. Each of us pay a percentage of our research portion. So out of Sea Grant's overall budget of $73 million, that's about $1 million of our dollars goes towards SBIR. And across the entire agency, about 1 million of that was small business aquaculture. So we're working internally to get more aquaculture topics into those calls each year so the small businesses can be applying for it. And there's just a link there for the FY18 budget submission that the president just put out. And some other notes as Congress did highlight that relatively low production in aquaculture is a major lost opportunity for job creation in their 2017 bill that just got passed. In the last 5 years, Sea Grant alone has put in $38.6 million, and that includes match. Every dollar of federal that goes out for Sea Grant has to be matched 50 cents of non-federal dollars, so that helps increase our mark, and it really helps get the industry and others to buy into what's happening with that match. And this just shows the money comes in, that $9 million you saw does not include what the state Sea Grant programs fund through their request for proposals. So the orange is the National Strategic Investments, the green is the National Strategic Investments, the state selection, the program selected them, and then the green, or the blue is what the state programs put in additionally from their core funding. So Sea Grant extension, as many of you know, because you're in here and you're in the room, and many of the rest of you are extension agents, but we conduct applied research that address the stakeholder needs. We translate and communicate science to practice, boots on the ground, trusted brokers. We give out the facts and the figures and let other people make their decisions. And we lead workforce development and training. And that top picture is actually from Wisconsin, from one of the schools that is doing an agricultural degree. And there's a lot of aquaculture going on. And I'm sure some of the folks in the room can tell you more about that as well. And sometimes it takes a village. And so where we do research, it's not just NOAA doing, and it's not just USDA, and it's not public versus private. And this example of development of alternative feeds, it started as a USDA NOAA joint effort, providing leadership and direction. California Sea Grant played a big part in this as well. ARS and NIMS labs. We had Sea Grant and Salt and Stall Kennedy funds to extramural labs and companies. SBIR to specific companies. FDA then came in this spring with the approval of taurine for feeds, and funding has also come in from soy farmers in the F3 challenge. So from this, 2 entirely plant-based fish feeds have since been commercialized with funding from all these groups, and it's now being tested at Pacifico Aquaculture, an open ocean offshore facility in Ensenada, Mexico that recently earned a best practices certificate. And I'm sure if you have any questions, Paul Olin will be able to answer them for you. If you want to find out more about NOAA aquaculture products and projects, there's 3 different links here. The first one are all the projects that Sea Grant has funded since 1995 and impacts and accomplishments. Finding the partners, there's also a NIMS site and an NOS site for the spatial planning. Now, what have you done in aquaculture? I know it's right after break, so please stand up if you have changed an aquaculture or industry or product with your research. If you've had research that's changed an aquaculture industry or product. Okay, thanks. Some people are standing up. Okay, stay standing. Now, if you've done the same thing by extending your knowledge of others' research. So if you've taken other people's research to help an aquaculture industry or product. And if you've helped via the outcomes of selected projects by a funding call, if you've written an RFP, if you've helped select projects and fund them. Okay, we'll do some jumping jacks now. No, look around at everyone, and you can sit down now. And I bet many of the folks that are still sitting, if we think about it some more over drinks, can probably be standing as well. And my challenge to you the rest of this conference is circulate and learn what each person in this room is doing, because we can all work together. Now, taking LaDon's 10-year vision, let's think about where we want aquaculture to be in the next 30 to 50 years. To get there, each of us can work together to influence this future. We will do it with facts and data, with available funding calls, through regulations in some cases, and it's really that extension model of changing behaviors over time. And I know I'm getting the end of my time, so I'm here all week, so I'll save questions for happy hours or tomorrow or someplace else. But really, the tide is rising, and I say again, because many of you have been through this again, I think DC is now a place that's talking about aquaculture. We hear it all the time. NOAA's talking about it all the time at the highest levels in NIMS and downtown. So let's lead the way. Let's move forward and make this really happen. Thank you.